Interview avec William Lane Craig, l'Adam historique, partie 1, Adam dans l'Ancien Testament. Bonjour, pouvez-vous vous présenter?
Bonjour à tous, je suis heureux d'avoir cette occasion de parler avec vous aujourd'hui. J'ai considéré momentanément de faire cet entretien en français, mais malheureusement, mon français est très embrouillé maintenant et j'ai peur que je ferai trop de fautes. Alors, nous le ferons en anglais. I am an American Christian philosopher and theologian. I did my doctoral work in philosophy at the University of Birmingham in England. And then, after living for a year in France, my wife and I moved to Germany, where I earned my second doctorate at the University of Munich in theology. Totally, Jan and I lived for 13 years in Europe in 4 different countries, including 7 years in Belgium as a visiting scholar at the Université de Louvain. And then we moved back to the United States, and I'm currently affiliated with Houston Christian University and Talbot School of Theology. In 2007, we founded a web-based ministry called Reasonable Faith, of which I am the president.
Pourquoi s'intéresser à la question de l'Adam historique?
I would say that the question of the historicity of Adam and Eve is important primarily for its impact upon your doctrine of Scripture and upon the person of Christ. The reason I say that is that if Scripture is inspired by God and therefore inerrant and authoritative in all that it teaches, if it teaches that there is a historical Adam and there was not, then we are going to have to do major renovations in our doctrine of inspiration and authority. We are going to have to revise significantly our doctrine of Scripture, and that would be a real a difficult undertaking. The other implication would be, I'm firmly convinced that Jesus himself believed that there was a historical Adam. His references to Adam and Eve suggest that he thought they were historical people that actually lived. Now, we Christians believe that Jesus Christ is God incarnate, and therefore, as God, he has the essential attributes of God, including omniscience. And omniscience is the property of knowing only and all truths. An omniscient being cannot believe any falsehoods. So if Jesus of Nazareth believed that there was a historical Adam, and there was not, that implies that he held false beliefs and therefore could not be divine. And so this would be a major reverberation in your theological structure if you have to revise your understanding of Christ. You would need to figure out some way that Jesus could be God and yet affirm this false belief. And those are tasks that one would rather not undertake unless it were absolutely necessary.
Que pensez-vous de l'interprétation du cadre, mise en évidence par Henri Blocher et d'autres?
For the sake of our listeners, let's explain what the framework interpretation is. The framework interpretation says that the days of Genesis chapter 1 are not literal consecutive days. Rather, they are a sort of literary device. They are a literary framework on which the author hangs his narrative. And so the claim is that there's a sort of parallelism between days 1 to 3 and days 4 to 6. On days 1 to 3, a domain is created. And then on days 4 to 6, the inhabitants of those domains are created. And so it's not intended to be a chronological narrative. This is a literary structure. Well, I have two major reservations about this interpretation. First, I think when you examine the narrative closely, the parallelism is not exact. For example, what corresponds to God's creating the lights in the firmament on day 4? Well, clearly, it's the creation of the firmament on day 2. On day 2, God creates the firmament, and then on day 4, he places the lights in it. Similarly, what corresponds to the creation of the sea creatures on day 5? Well, it's the creation of the seas on day 3. And finally, on day 3, God creates not only the dry land and the seas, but also creates the vegetation and the fruit trees. So God doesn't simply create the domain, he also creates some of the occupants of the domain on that day. So I think it's simply not correct to see a parallelism between days 1 and 4, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6. The parallelism doesn't stand up. I think it's more in the mind of the beholder or the interpreter than it is in the text. Second major reservation would be that it's very difficult to believe that the chronology in the narrative is not to be taken seriously. Notice how the author orders the day with ordinal numbers: 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and describes the progression of God's creation of the biosphere from an uninhabitable waste, an earth covered by a primordial ocean, through the dry land and the seas, the vegetation, and then the animals and marine life, and finally man. I think it's undeniable that what we have here is a narrative that is intended to be chronologically ordered and not simply a literary framework. And therefore, I'm not persuaded by the framework hypothesis.
Dans votre livre, vous affirmez que Genèse 1 à 11 est de la mytho-histoire. Qu'entendez-vous par là au juste?
Yes, it is a strange appellation, isn't it? This is a term that was coined by the great Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen to characterize a sort of blend of traditional mythology with actual historical persons and events. And Genesis 1 to 11, the whole primeval history up until the call of Abraham, exhibits what I call the family resemblances of myth. Primarily myths, as the term is used by folklorists, not as it's used in popular vernacular, but is used by folklorists. Myths are traditional sacred stories which are attempt to found the institutions and practices and values of a culture in the deep primordial past. And certainly this is what Genesis 1 to 11 tries to do. And so it has these central earmarks of myth in the folklorist's sense of the word. But it also structures these stories by a pattern of genealogical descent from Adam to Abraham. And these genealogies turn these primeval stories into a primeval history. It orders them chronologically. And the genealogies meld smoothly, without a seam, into Abraham and his descendants, people whom the Pentateuchal author undoubtedly regarded as historical persons. And so this suggests that the earlier persons in the genealogies were also regarded as historical. So what we have here, I think, is a quasi-historical narrative that is told in the figurative and often metaphorical language of myth.
Comment pouvons-nous prier pour vous?
I'm currently writing this systematic philosophical theology. It's an enormous project. It's probably going to take me at least 10 years. And so I would pray that the Lord would give me the endurance and the perseverance to keep working at this day after day after day, to just keep moving forward and not to flag or fail. So that would be a prayer request, and would ask for prayer for our ministry in general. A reasonable faith is touching lives all around the world. Much of our material is translated into other languages, and every month we have about 3 million engagements with our online material. And I don't mean simply clicks, I mean engagements, either commenting or watching a video or liking something, reading an article. And so the ministry is having a worldwide impact. People are coming to Christ through it, or in many cases coming back to Christ after having lost their faith in high school or college. And many Christians are growing in their understanding of Christian doctrine and becoming better equipped to defend the Christian faith. So should the Lord bring us to mind, pray for these many ministries of reasonable faith.
Merci à William Lane Craig. Partie 2 à venir. Adam dans le Nouveau Testament et les sciences.